In this video, we will focus on influence and persuasion, and specifically we'll focus on how we can inspire change using principles and practices of influence and persuasion. We'll begin by answering the question, what are influence and persuasion? And after that, we'll have a brief discussion about the importance of recognizing our own boundaries of expertise prior to engage in processes related to influence and persuasion. After that, we'll address three important things that we need to think about when it comes to the actual persuasion process itself, and that is first, to understand the audience, second, to craft an effective message, and then third, to tell a story effectively. So let's begin with that first question. What are influence and persuasion? Well, let's begin by defining influence, or social influence, if you will. And here's a direct quote from Cassiopo and colleagues from 2018. The quote is, "Social influence is change in preferences or behavior that one individual or group causes in another." Now, what's important to note is that persuasion is actually a specific type of social influence, and we can define persuasion as, quote, active attempt by an individual, group, or social entity, such as a government, political party, or business, to change a person's beliefs, attitudes, or behaviors by conveying important information, feelings, or reasoning. And this quote comes from that same Cassiopo and colleagues article from 2018. So persuasion can be applied to change or influence a number of different things, such as thoughts, feelings, mindsets, ideas, behaviors, and more broadly, the implementation or design of systems, policies, procedures, and practices within an organization. So let's talk about some human resource specific examples of influence and persuasion. So let's imagine that we're trying to, for example, persuade decision makers to invest in a data-informed employee retention initiative. Or that perhaps we're trying to persuade HR professionals to build their own data literacy skills. In other words, to upskill in that particular area. Or we might persuade decision makers to support the development of an AI selection method of some kind, or multiple artificial intelligence selection methods within our organization. And as the last HR example, perhaps we want to persuade frontline managers to check in with employees regularly regarding their performance, and perhaps this is based on some data-informed practices that we're recommending. So what is the value of influence and persuasion, though? Well, in terms of HR analytics, I like to think about the value of influence and persuasion from the perspective of the HR analytics project lifecycle, where we have these distinct phases of question formulation, data acquisition, data management, data analysis, data interpretation and storytelling, and deployment and implementation. Well, I think while influence and persuasion can definitely come to life in each of these different phases, I think they best come to life in the last two phases of the HR analytics project lifecycle, which are data interpretation and storytelling, and deployment and implementation. And more specifically, effective influence and persuasion tactics can help HR analytics teams move from that data interpretation and storytelling phase to more effective deployment and implementation. So, in other words, we're really talking about how effective influence and persuasion can facilitate the leap from knowledge to action, or what Pfeffer and Sutton refer to as closing the knowing-doing gap. Okay, so taking what we know from data interpretation and storytelling, and then turning that into something, or translating that into actual action, prescribed action in the organization, something that we can actually deploy and then implement as well. So in terms of recognizing our own boundaries of expertise, this is an important first thing to do before we start deciding how we're going to persuade and influence an audience to change their mind, to change their thoughts, behaviors, or to change some system or design a new system, policy, procedure within the organization that we're trying to influence. So if we're not practicing metacognition and self-awareness, we may find ourselves wading into areas that are beyond our own boundaries of expertise. Without additional training or support to expand those boundaries, this could result in problems for ourselves and for our audience or stakeholders. So for ethical reasons, it's good to be aware of the limits of our levels of knowledge, skill, education, training, and expertise as they relate to a specific area. And for reasons of influence and persuasion, Knowing our boundaries of expertise and thus relying on what we do know can help us craft a greater number of higher quality arguments in support of what we're trying to persuade others to do. So again, it's important to recognize the boundaries of our own expertise so that we're going to do our due diligence and we're going to be able to craft a message that's going to be more persuasive, and it's going to be one that hopefully is more accurate and has more expertise behind it as well. So before we move on from this, it's worth pointing out a couple, first a definition and one a psychological theory that relate to recognizing our boundaries of expertise. And the first is a word that I really like. I think it's a fun word to say, which is ultra-crepidarianist. And this would be a person who offers advice, provides guidance, and or shares opinions about something that is outside of their boundaries of expertise. This is obviously something we want to avoid when we're in the position where we could influence or persuade an audience to do something or to not do something. Another psychological or another thing I'd like to focus on in this regard is the Dunning-Kruger effect that comes out of psychology. And what this theory generally finds, and this was developed by Kruger and Dunning, and one of the often cited articles is from 1999. And these two scholars, they found that in general, those with lower competence tend to actually overestimate their own competence levels, whereas those with a higher competence tend to underestimate their own competence. And so this really gets the idea that sometimes the more you know about something, the more you realize you don't yet know, and you might actually underestimate your own competence levels. But I think the important take-home message is when you're new to an area and you don't have a lot of expertise yet, you might actually be overconfident in what you think you know already. And so it's worth working with other people who you can recognize as having greater levels of expertise so you can hopefully help calibrate that a little bit better, and that you don't wade into areas that are really firmly beyond where you should be wading into because they're beyond your boundaries of expertise at the moment. Okay, so now let's move on and talk about one of the first three overarching areas we should consider when it comes to trying to create a persuasive argument and message that we can ultimately tell to an audience. And that is, first, we need to think about the audience themselves and try to understand the audience. What are their needs? Who are they? What's their background? And how are we going to communicate with them, and in what way? What kind of tone are we going to set? And those types of considerations. So I find that it's often helpful to consider how we're going to understand the audience by asking a series of questions. So, for example, broadly speaking, we can ask who and what questions. So let's take a moment to drill a little bit deeper into who questions we can ask about our expected or known audience, such as who are the audience members? So you might also follow that up by asking, how heterogeneous is your audience? So are these people from different backgrounds? They have different expertise, skill levels, different functional areas within the organization. And how do they differ? And how are they similar? So to what extent are your audience members relatively similar, or do they differ quite a bit? Is this a fairly diverse audience in terms of their background, standing within the organization, structural power level within the organization, and so forth and so on? You might also ask, what do they value? What are their needs? And what are their backgrounds or roles in the organization, or maybe in prior organizations, if that's relevant? Also, what problems do they need to have solved? It's good to walk in knowing what they value and what they see as being most important, as this is an important way to understand who the audience members are, what makes them tick, so to speak. So we can also ask, why are they in your audience, or why are they your audience to begin with? Okay, so what is the purpose for them to being the people that are going to be listening to your message, that are going to be watching your message, or some combination of the two, or perhaps even just reading the message? And also, are there certain key audience members you need to appeal to even more than others? So being able to identify those audience members who perhaps maybe have more decision-making power, or the ability to influence others within the organization, or can't convey your message more broadly. You might also ask, how much time do they have, or are they willing to listen to your story and message? And obviously, you're going to have to adjust your message length accordingly and ultimately the story that you're telling around it accordingly by shortening it. And typically, the higher up you go in the organization in terms of the audience members, especially as you get closer to the C-suite or the executives, you'll probably want to make sure your story is more succinct and it's shorter than perhaps to other audiences. And then also you can ask, will the audience be in person or will they be remote? Will the audience read, see, or hear your message or parts of your message asynchronously or synchronously? These are important questions to ask because obviously you're going to have different considerations in terms of keeping people engaged if you're face-to-face with them in person versus if they are accessing remotely via a video conferencing platform like Zoom or Google Meet or something similar. And we also want to consider how are people going to get through the message and the associated story if it is being communicated asynchronously, such as through an email or a written report or a pre-recorded presentation or video of some kind. The next broad question we can ask is, what is your relationship to the audience? In other words, does the audience already know and trust you? And in comparison to the audience, where do you sit in the organizational hierarchy? Are these essentially your audience members are in the same level, more or less, as you within the organization? Or are they higher up in the organization, which is often the case, especially if you're making a request or a proposal for change, especially a system level change within the organization, chances are they're going to be at a higher level of management than you are. The third broad question we can ask is, does the audience perceive you as credible and trust you? So, is the audience aware of your prior work and success? Do you have any use cases you can show them, or small wins or big wins, even better, that you can show them to help build your credibility and hopefully build some trust that they can follow what you're doing, and hopefully that will lead to success like your prior work. Also, the question you might ask is, does the audience perceive your functional area as credible? So not just you, but the functional area within which you work in the organization, such as HR analytics or HR more generally. If they don't perceive that as credible, that could be a little bit of a challenge to try to convince them that your functional area is a worthwhile and strategic contributor to the organization, and that the due diligence and quality and rigor of the work that went into that is going to be of a level that you can actually trust it, and that it's going to lead to positive outcomes. Fourth, we can ask the question, what decision-making authority do key audience members, or just the audience in general, have? Okay, so for example, what organizational power does the audience have? What kind of decision-making power or authority do they have? Is this the right audience who can actually rubber stamp or say, yes, we can proceed forward with your proposal, or no? Are they an intermediary audience where you need to first convince them before you can move up to a higher level of the organization with greater decision-making authority, or with the ability to make the decision at all that you're proposing? Relatedly, which audience members have the power to take your idea or your proposal and turn it into action? So this gets back to that previous question related to who are the key members of the audience that you should really tailor your message towards. The fifth question that we can ask is, how do key audience members, or just how does the audience in general, prefer to make decisions? So, for example, how much do they rely on data? How much do they like to rely on data? Do they value data or evidence-informed decision-making? And conversely, how much do they rely on intuition? Do they prefer to go by that gut feeling they have? And if it's a combination of the two, how do you tell your message accordingly? What types of evidence do the audience members find most compelling? Well, an associated question here would be, do they appreciate anecdotes that support data analytics findings, for example? And then finally, do the audience members dislike or fear working with data, or feel uncomfortable making data-informed decisions? This gets more specific to some issues that you might encounter with HR analytics specific types of presentations and proposals, where you are going to be communicating findings based on data that you have access to. And so do people come into this audience having some kind of fear or discomfort with working with data? They don't maybe perceive themselves as having high enough levels of data literacy to interpret the findings. accurately or in a way that they can understand, well, how can you make them feel more comfortable? And also, what can you do to maybe even get them excited about working with data by the end of your message and your story? So one thing that I think can be quite effective when you're trying to understand who the audience is and maybe practicing in terms of how you're going to communicate the message is to consider making profiles that capture different audience segments. And so I've seen this done at an organization where they actually had little playing cards or scorecards where just fictitious people, but it'd be a way to, how do you have a discussion with this person or influence this person or explain something to this person based on their background and their different competence areas. So for example, here we have a fictitious person who works in the benefits specialist role, is a benefits specialist within the human resources department. And you can see that they have a high level of competence in human resources, which is not surprising. They have a moderate level of expertise in business acumen, not very much expertise in this case in data literacy, relatively low expertise in technology, and then a little bit higher level of expertise in law and ethics. So knowing these types of competencies on which people can vary can be really useful to try to make sure that you're tailoring your message and the associated story at an appropriate level for the audience and for specific different groups within the audience. Sometimes it helps to actually segment your audience into broader groups. So in addition to the who questions, we can also ask the what questions, which briefly can be questions like, what do you want the audience to know, believe, or do? And how will you communicate with your audience? Meaning, what types of mode of communication are you going to use? Is it going to be written? Is it going to be oral? Is it going to be a presentation? Is it going to be an email? How are you going to try to influence and persuade the audience? Through what mechanism or mode or medium? And then also, what tone will your communication set? Are you trying to set a somber tone that we're in a very precarious situation right now? It's a high-risk situation. Things could go from bad to worse, for example. Or is it going to be more of an uplifting tone, inspirational tone, a tone that'll hopefully get people excited? You really need to think about specifically what are you trying to propose people to change, and how are you best going to influence them along that process in terms of the tone that you're setting. So another thing to consider too when it comes to audience is asking ourselves, well, how ready are they for change, and what are their intentions to change? So let's think about these in terms of two different theoretical models. And these models can be really useful to help us assess individual audience members' readiness for change and or their intention to change. So, for example, we'll focus on the trans-theoretical model, and we'll focus on the theory of planned behavior. And in addition, we want to be also aware that humans have a natural tendency to resist change initiatives to begin with. Okay, so that's something if we're trying to persuade people to do something, to feel something, to think something, we need to be aware that people tend to not like to change that often and that much. And so we should be aware that we're going to have some people that will likely be resistant no matter what. And so what can we do about that? So we'll also talk about that. So let's first begin with assessing our audience's readiness for change. And so I think the trans-theoretical model, which is often attributed to, or at least the early stages of it, to Prochaska and Di Clemente from 1983. And so here's an adaptation I'm going to walk you through of the trans-theoretical model. It's often used for behavior modification, health behavior purposes, if we're trying to change people's health behaviors, like to get them to stop smoking and or to get them to exercise more or something like that. But I think the principles of this model can be really useful for thinking about change within organizations too at the individual level, and how do we meet people where they are in terms of their readiness for change. So the first stage of the trans-theoretical model is what is referred to as pre-contemplation. And when people are in pre-contemplation, they really don't have an intention to make a change, and they really don't have much of an awareness that a change might be needed at all. Okay, so for example, if the goal is to change people's level of data literacy, perhaps we've recognized that it's important for all the HR professionals, or just for for that matter, all people within the organization need to upskill in that area of data literacy. Perhaps you have someone who's in the pre-contemplation stage who just thinks, I have no intention to improve my data literacy, and it hasn't even crossed my mind that I might need to. Now, the next stage is what's called the contemplation stage. So we go from pre-contemplation to contemplation. And the contemplation stage is that people here, they're going to have some awareness that change is needed, but they haven't made a commitment to actually engaging in the change or doing the change, whatever that might be. So for example, someone in this situation might think, I recognize that I need to improve my data literacy, but I haven't yet made a firm commitment to doing so. Maybe I'll revisit this next year. So they know that there's a change that needs to happen. They've contemplated it, but there's no sense of urgency here and no commitment to it. Now, people who are in the preparation stage of the trans-theoretical model, these people are committed to the needed change, and they're actually actively preparing plans to make that needed change. So someone in this particular stage of preparation might think, I'm 100% committed to improving my data literacy, and I'm seeking advice and resources regarding what steps I need to take and what my initial goals should be. In the next stage, we call this action. And in action, this is where people who are in this stage, they have enacted the needed change behaviors. So they're doing the thing that we want them to change or to engage in, okay? And so someone in this phase might think, I'm doing it. I have taken several Udemy courses. I have come up with a professional development plan with my manager, and I am actively working towards using data to inform decision-making and action. So people in this stage, they are doing it, and they are committed at this point, at least in this moment, to actually doing the change that has been asked of them or that they are asking of themselves. And the next stage is the maintenance stage. And the maintenance stage is where people who are in this area of readiness for change, they're actively maintaining the needed change behavior, and they're not falling back on the old ways of doing things. And so this is an important stage because we want to make sure people get from action, so initially engaging in the behavior that's desired, and that they actually maintain that long term, because sometimes when things get stressful, they'll fall back on the old ways of doing things. So someone in the maintenance stage might think, whoa, things have been getting super busy and I'm working hard not to fall back on my old ways of doing things. And I should note too that there's actually a final stage as proposed by Prochaska and De Clemente, and that is the relapse stage of the trans-theoretical model. But we're not going to focus on this for the sake of brevity. Okay, so in addition to getting the audience and determining at what stage they are in terms of readiness to change and how to tailor our messaging and story accordingly, it's also worthwhile to consider the audience's intention to change at all. And this is where the theory of planned behavior, which is the seminal article being Asian from 1991, really comes into play here. So ultimately, with this theory of planned behavior, we're trying to focus on the outcome of someone actually engaging in a particular behavior. Now, the planned behavior part, this is where the intention comes in. And so an intention in this particular context within the theory of planned behavior is that this is assuming someone has control over their ability to perform a behavior. And in this case, an intention has to do with the motivation and inclination a person has to perform the target behavior, such as how much effort they're willing to apply and how long they'll be willing to persist in attempting to perform the target behavior. Now, the theory proposes that people who have a higher level of intention to perform the behavior are going to be more likely to then actually perform the behavior, which is fairly intuitive. But it also proposes that there are three other factors, the first of which is attitudes towards the behavior, that also influence a person's intention to perform that behavior, and ultimately that intention it is going to predict their likelihood of performing that behavior. So an attitude here, and more specifically an attitudes towards the target behavior, this really refers to the person's positive or negative evaluation of the behavior in question. Do they see it as favorable or unfavorable? Do they like it? Do they dislike it? And so forth. The second factor are subjective norms. And this is a person's perception about the behavior in question and the extent to which it's influenced by others. So specifically, the perception of the individual that the behavior is typical or expected in the organization among their peers or other people who work there. Okay? And again, this factor is thought to influence behavior through a person's intentions to perform that behavior. The third factor that can influence intention, according to this theory, is perceived behavioral control. And this is conceptually related to the concept of self-efficacy, which is related to a person's belief or confidence in their ability to do something. Now, perceived behavioral control, more specifically, is a person's belief that they have the necessary resources available and opportunities that will help facilitate their performance of the behavior in question, whatever that might be. Okay? And so this is a really important one right here, is this perceived behavioral control. You really need to make sure, if you want people to engage or you want to influence them to engage in a particular behavior, you want to make sure that they perceive that they have control, that they have the resources and they have the opportunities. In other words, that there's no obstacles in their way to performing that behavior should they want to perform that behavior or have the intention to perform that behavior. So let's think through an example here where, let's say the target behavior is investing in an employee retention initiative. So we're trying to influence or persuade a key decision maker that we need to invest in the employee retention initiative. And so let's apply this in the context of the theory of planned behavior. So looking just at the link between intention and the target behavior of investing in employee retention initiative, we could ask the question, does the person intend to support the initiative to invest in the employee retention program? And are they motivated to do so? So if the answer to this question is, gosh, it doesn't look like they have much of an intention to do this, and they don't really seem motivated to actually invest in this employee retention initiative at the moment, then we can start thinking back to the other factors that are going to drive intentions theoretically, which are attitude, norms, and control, and then try to identify and ask questions that can help us understand, okay, then what is going on that's affecting their intention to invest in the employee retention initiative, and how might we actually increase their intentions via attitudes, norms, and control? So let's start with attitudes towards the behavior. So looking at the link between attitudes towards behavior and intention, we might ask the question, what are the person's attitudes as they relate to supporting the employee retention initiative? In terms of norms, we might ask the question, do other people in the organization intend to support the initiative? Is there social pressure to support the initiative or to not support the initiative? And in terms of perceptions of behavioral control with respect to investing in the employee retention initiative, we might ask the questions, does the person have the necessary resources to support the initiative? Maybe they don't see that they have the decision-making authority to support the initiative, or maybe they don't see that that they actually have the knowledge in order to know whether or not they should be advocating for this new employee retention initiative. Might also ask, does the person face any barriers to supporting and investing in the employee retention initiative? We might also ask, does the person have past experience supporting similar initiatives that we can remind them of? So all of these things, by kind of breaking down the attitudes towards the target behavior, the subjective norms related to that target behavior, and the perceived behavioral control, we can hopefully start to identify what are the areas for specific audience members where we really need to focus our message to help them start forming intentions and motivation to actually do, think, feel, or actually affect change in the way that we want them to. So as I mentioned earlier, we also, in addition to considering the audience's readiness for change and their intention to change, we also want to consider the very human thing, which is to resist change. So we want to focus on resistance to change as well. So when we're encouraging a change, resistance to change should be expected and anticipated. And so you might have some people that are in this category that we can refer to as active resistance, where these are people that not only don't want to go along with what you're trying to influence or persuade them to do, or that you may be trying to influence and persuade them to do, but they just really will go out of their way to actively resist and convince other people within the organization to also not go along with whatever you might intend to propose or to change within the organization. In addition, we might have some people that are in the passive resistant category, which is they resist the change and what you're proposing or what you might eventually propose to change, but they aren't going to be necessarily going around and convincing other people. So they're just going to passively not support the change, but they're not going to be actively trying to influence others to do the same. You might also have people, and this is obviously more desirable, who are in the compliance category. And these are people who they'll go along with what you propose, or they might go along with what you're eventually going to propose, but they're not really going to go around and champion what you're doing or convince other people to get on the same get on the same page as the prescribed change or the proposed change. The best case situation is when you have a lot of people who are in the category of enthusiastic supporters. These are people who are not only going to go along with the change, but they also are going to be cheerleading and championing the change to others and trying to convince other people to get on board because they see the value in it. So it's important before you start crafting your message to start envisioning in what category might people be with respect to resistance to change, and what kind of information do you need to include? What kind of arguments do you need to include within your messaging and your story to convince people who are in different categories? Obviously, it's going to be much easier if you have most people are already going to be likely enthusiastic supporters of what you're going to propose. But if you have people who you expect are going to be actively resisting the change or even passively resisting the change, you're probably going to have more work cut out for you, and you need to really, especially if these are key decision makers in your audience, really focus on them and try to think critically. How can you move them at least into compliance, if not into the enthusiastic support category? So what are some of the reasons for why people resist change? As I mentioned, this is a very human tendency. Well, we can think of the following factors. Sometimes it's just personality. Sometimes people have a stable dispositional tendency to dislike change and things in general. And so, for example, people with higher levels of negative affectivity, they have a tendency to experience more positive and negative, or rather more negative emotions like anxiety and anxiety and anger. And people who have that stable dispositional tendency, they tend to not also like their jobs that much, and they don't tend to, of course, like change and things like that. Another reason for resisting change is feelings of uncertainty. If you're proposing some kind of change, it's going to change the status quo, and you're potentially going to be pushing or recommending people think about something, do something, or feel something that's in an unknown area, and that can feel uncomfortable. We need to recognize that and try to address that where it's possible. Also, fear of failure can be a reason for resisting change. If people feel that this could be an area in which they personally will experience a loss or could experience a loss, we need to be cognizant of that and try to include in our messaging different content that can help assuage or make them less concerned about the fear of failure and make them more hopeful, ideally. Another reason for resistance to change could be disrupted habits. People are creatures of habits. Human beings are a creature of habits. And we need to recognize that if we're proposing a change, we're trying to persuade people to do something differently, that's going to have an impact on them very directly, and it's going to make them do something in a different way or think something in a different way. And that goes against the inertia that they already have going for them. Another reason for resisting change is the personal impact of the change. Some people are going to stand to gain from a change. Some people may stand to lose, at least from their perspective. And we need to be aware of that. And we need to also try to tailor some of our messaging for those people who perceive that they might be at a loss or potential loss. And then finally, prevalence of change matters. If your organization has been doing a lot of change initiatives and there hasn't been a lot of success, well, even if there has been a lot of success, but there's a lot of change going on, we need to be cognizant of that and make sure we have some empathy for people and understand that this is going to be tough. This is something that means that they have a lot of disrupted habits, disrupted ways of doing things, and they're really learning new things and learning how to think differently, do things differently, and feel things differently, perhaps on an ongoing basis. So again, these are different. Understanding these reasons for resisting change can be really useful for trying to figure out how we're going to talk to our audience and what types of evidence we're going to present to them, and hopefully targeting different segments of the audience to give more tailored messaging to hopefully reduce these factors, although there's not much you can do about personality, but at least reduce some of the other factors and their impact on potential resistance to change. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of understanding the audience. Now let's talk about how we can go about actually crafting the message and what we should actually consider. Where the message is where we're going to have the content with which is going to be the basis or the foundation of our influence and persuasion. So a carefully crafted message establishes a foundation for influencing and persuading our audience. The message contains the content and arguments that will hopefully persuade our audience to think, feel, or do something specifically or in particular that we're trying to get them to do. So it helps to articulate specifically how you intend to change the audience's thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, as this is the end state of the subsequent storytelling process that we'll get to here in a little bit. So again, take a moment to actually write these things or type these things down and articulate specifically what is your end state here? Where do you want to take the audience? What is your call to action? And what is your desired state of affairs that you want to lead the audience to? And make sure you have that very clear as you start refining and crafting the message that you'd like to use to support your influence and persuasion practice. Now, the relevance of our message and the quantity and quality of our arguments related to that message, and these can really have important implications. And so, for example, let's think about a particular study here. And so this is a study by Petty and Cacioppo from 1984, and I think it does a nice job. Not only are the findings fairly compelling and interesting, but I think they also introduce 3 different factors that we should really be considering when it comes to what we should include in our message and how we should do that. Okay, so a little bit of background on this study. Again, published in 1984. This was actually a sample of 168 undergraduate students from the University of Missouri. In the study, the participants read an essay in which a fictitious chairperson of the University Committee on Academic Policy recommended changes in some academic policy, with the idea that this is a student sample, and so therefore something related to academic policy should have at least minimal relevance to them, given that they're in a university setting. So in terms of the methodology, the participants were randomly assigned to one of 8 unique conditions based on a 3-factor design, where there's 3 specific factors that we're going to talk about. The first is issue involvement, which has to do with how relevant the appeal for change was. Was it a low issue involvement or high issue involvement? The next was argument quality. So were weak or strong arguments presented in support of the change that was being proposed? And the final factor, the third factor, being the number of arguments. So was there a low number of arguments presented or a higher number of arguments presented in support of the proposed change? And again, these have to do with recommended changes in an academic policy. All fictitious. It's a scenario-based vignette that the participants were exposed to, but hopefully had some degrees of fidelity to the real life where they feel some personal connection to it. So the outcome that we're going to be considering here is participants self-reported their attitudes towards the academic policy change proposal after they were given after they were exposed to the message, which again varied on the 3 conditions of issue involvement, argument quality, and argument number. Okay, so first thing, we're going to be constructing some plots here. The type of analysis they ran that we're going to be looking at here and that the data visualizations are going to be based on was a 3-way analysis of variance, or a 3-way ANOVA. And so you can see here on this plot, we've got on the x-axis the number of arguments, so 3 arguments versus 9 arguments. And so participants were randomly assigned to receive either 3 or 9 arguments in support of the academic policy change, where 3 would be a low number of arguments and 9 would be a high number of arguments. In terms of our outcome variable, as I mentioned earlier, this is the participants, their self-reported attitudes towards the academic policy change proposal initiative. And this is after they were exposed to the message content. Now, we're going to first look at those people who are randomly assigned to the what is called the low relevance category or low issue involvement category. And these are people who, and if you recall, this has to do with how relevant the appeal for change was, the proposed change initiative was. Was it low or high? And so some people, they were told, or what they read indicated that the proposed academic policy change was to take place in the next year, which would be a high level of relevance because they could be potentially, they could have a stake in this. They could actually, this could affect them personally. And then for other people who are randomly assigned to the other condition, the low issue involvement condition or the low relevance condition, these people were told that this policy would go into effect in 10 years or so. So it's much more distant or distal in the future and has less relevance to them accordingly because they don't necessarily think that they're going to be directly impacted by this. So what we find is people who perceive that the appeal has low relevance, that the issue at hand really isn't, isn't relevant for them because again, it's going to be 10 years in the future that this could take effect. Well, what it turns out they found was that if they were presented with weak arguments in support of the proposed academic policy change, we saw this positive relationship between the number of arguments and their attitudes afterwards, where higher scores on attitudes mean more favorable attitudes. And so even if people were presented with weak arguments, if you gave them a higher number of weak arguments, they tended to have more favorable attitudes. And interestingly, people who were presented with strong arguments, they saw a similar pattern. So you can see, maybe slightly higher descriptively number in terms of their attitudes. But really what we're seeing here is that what matters most, if people don't see the issue that you're proposing change for to be that relevant for them, the number of arguments seems to be more important when it comes to actually influencing their attitudes about the particular change initiative that you're trying to influence them or persuade them to care about. Now, in another group of people, they were exposed to the high relevance condition. And in these people, they were told that this academic policy change would happen within the next year. So therefore perceived that this was more relevant to them personally, that they might have a stake or be the recipient of the effects of this particular policy change. And what we found here was that a negative relationship emerged between the number of arguments and the attitudes towards the academic policy change. And what this shows is that if you have weak arguments, we see this negative relationship where it's worse to have more weak arguments when people actually care about or see that the change is relevant for them personally. Whereas conversely, if someone is presented with strong arguments, it's actually kind of the opposite effect, where people are going to perceive that the more arguments, the higher the number of arguments, if they're strong arguments, is going to be much better in terms of them forming more favorable attitudes towards this academic policy change in this example. And so the takeaway is this. So when people don't really see themselves as that involved in the proposed change and they don't see the issue as very relevant for themselves, then the strength of the argument in support of the change is less important than the number of arguments or the quantity of arguments. In fact, when people don't really see the proposed change as relevant for them personally, then the message content should focus on having more arguments. Okay, so if they don't care about it, they don't see it as relevant for themselves, then you can get away with having just more arguments, and that seems to have a fairly good effect, a positive effect on attitudes. That being said, obviously it's better if you can do it to have stronger arguments, a greater number of stronger arguments if you can, but perhaps we don't need to be as much concerned, or at least the audience won't be as much concerned about the strength of the argument as long as there's a higher number of arguments when they don't really see personal relevance in whatever you're trying to get them to do, think, or feel, or persuade them to think, feel, and do. Now, in contrast, when people see themselves as having a personal stake or that they could be personally affected by a proposed change or something that you're trying to persuade them to do, then the quality of the arguments in the message content becomes much more important. In fact, to change people's attitudes towards the proposed change, it's probably going to be much more effective to have a larger number of higher quality arguments that are included in the message content to really get people to have more favorable attitudes about the change that we're trying to influence. So again, it's worth considering these three factors of issue involvement or relevance, the number of arguments, and the quality of the arguments as well when it comes to trying to change people's attitudes about a particular change. So there's some other considerations too when it comes to crafting the message as part of our influence and persuasion process. And the first is, don't equivocate or try to undersell your message. You've likely put more thought into your message than your audience. You've thought about this more than your audience, and so therefore don't be underconfident about it. If you are operating within your boundaries of expertise and you've done your work, you've done your due diligence, then make sure that you don't undersell your message. And also related to do not equivocate, try not to be ambiguous, and also try to seem like you're committed to this message as well, that you personally see the value in it. Now, the next thing that we want to consider is to make sure that the logic and the organization of our message and its content, that they're clear and well articulated. Okay, so make sure there's a clear outline that people can follow the story that you'll eventually take them on. We also want to consider that we should expect people to resist some or all of our message and the associated content. It's what human beings tend to do, and we need to prepare accordingly, as I was talking about earlier. We also want to be thoughtful and use thoughtful repetition to emphasize key takeaways in our message content. So sometimes people refer to the message of three. So something that you want people to walk away with and for it to be very memorable for them, especially if it's something that is something related to what you're trying to persuade them to do. Repeat it 3 times at different points in the presentation, maybe at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the presentation, and emphasize it at the end of the presentation as they're leaving. Don't do this a lot, but pick 2 to 5 things that you're going to use the rule 3 on to make sure that that's something they can commit to their memory and walk away with. And then also while we want to use data, we want to use facts in support of our message and our arguments. This can hopefully lead to higher quality arguments, as we were just talking about the implications of those a moment ago. We also want to have empathy on the audience, and we want to do as much as we can humanize those facts or those data by using clear examples or anecdotes. And we want to really balance this, the analytical persuasive techniques with the emotional persuasive techniques as well. So make sure you're appealing to both analytical and emotional messaging when it comes to crafting the message itself. Okay, so now let's talk about the final step, which actually is to tell the story. And from that story, hopefully this is where that deployment and implementation is going to come from. This is where you're going to prescribe that action. There's going to be that call to action. You're going to take people to and convince them that it's time to go to that desired state of affairs, whatever that might be. So let's first start by defining what storytelling is. Well, storytelling, we can define that as a process of communicating an account of a connected succession of events that is intended to instruct, inform, spur interest, entertain, and or persuade. And of course, persuasion is of the utmost relevance here in this video here today. So we can tell a story using virtually any mode of communication. And the ones that are going to be most relevant for us, often in an organizational setting, are going to be, of course, written reports, oral presentations, data visualization or dashboard, body language, or some combination of all of these. So let's now talk about what is the importance of effective storytelling. Why should we care about this? Well, I actually want to pull a direct quote, and this is from Denning from 2006, and this is a quote that's attributed to Seth Kahan, who was or is an organizational performance consultant. And the quote is this: "In my work at NASA, I coached leaders on how to tell stories that accelerated positive change. the first thing these leaders needed to realize is that their primary goal is to make change happen, not to be seen as a good storyteller. It's immaterial whether or not listeners are aware that a story is being told, much less that they admire the story. However, the listener's reactions in response to the story are critical. We are looking for changes in behavior that align with the leader's objectives. When that happens, you have a powerful change agent equipped with a powerful tool. So what I really like about this quote is really pointing out that it's not about the storyteller, it's about what is being told in the story. We're really, and what is being told in the story and how that's going to impact the audience or the listeners of that story. We're really mostly concerned with how that story and its content and the message content within it is going to resonate with that audience. And that should be our goal. What do we want the audience or the listener's reaction to our story to be? That should be what we target if we're really trying to accelerate positive change, as Seth Kahan puts it here. So now let's talk about the importance of how we actually structure our stories. So we take our content, our message content that's going to contain our persuasive arguments and the information that's relevant to persuade and influence people about whatever it is we're proposing change around. And we need to put that into an intelligible and hopefully compelling story structure. So a structure in this context refers to the manner in which a story unfolds, including key parts or components, the beginning, middle, and end, and so forth. Now, a good storytelling technique is to create some kind of tension. Build some tension during the story that's going to be in need of some kind of resolution, as this can be really key to effective storytelling. Now, there are many different types of story structures, such as linear structure, Freytag's dramatic structure, or the mountain structure, which is what we're going to walk through here in just a second. And we really just need to remember, though, that the message we're trying to convey, that we've already talked about in terms of the message content and arguments, this is really going to come to life through the story structure. So we really want to remember how important this story structure actually is. So let's talk now about the mountain structure. And I've adapted a lot of this from Knaflic, from Cole Knaflic's 2015 and 2020 books. And so the mountain structure is called this because visually you can see what looks like a triangle or a mountain, and you'll see kind of how this comes to life in just a second. But like just about any story, it should have a beginning, middle, and end, which it does. And first we begin with the plot, which is really where we're going to describe the gap between the current and the desired state of affairs. So where are we currently and where do we want to be? What is that gap? So this is where you're bringing this to the audience's attention. And hopefully this initially creates some initial tension for them. Okay? And then we have our rising action as we work towards the climax of our story. And during this process, this is where we increase the tension. So we're increasing the tension between the current and the desired state of affairs. Again, emphasizing this gap, that there's something that needs to be corrected. There's something that needs to be closed here. And this is where we hopefully create a sense of urgency that in order to compel people to agree that there is a gap. And what's more, that we should act on that gap to take us into that desired state of affairs. With the following action, this is where we lead to the ending of our story. And this is where we're ultimately trying to persuade the audience that action is needed to achieve the desired state of affairs. So, in addition to storytelling principles in general and story structures like the mountain structure, it's also worthwhile to think about what are some different tools or aids we can use during the storytelling process. Obviously, we can use presentation slides if we're doing a PowerPoint or using Google Slides. We can also use written reports. We can also use body language and oral communication skills. But we shouldn't forget about the importance, especially within the context of HR analytics, of data visualizations as storytelling tools. So data visualizations include things like graphs and plots and charts and dashboards. They can be interactive and they can be dynamic or they can be static. And data visualizations can be useful storytelling tools, but we really should note that they should only be used in the context of a story to help tell the story and move the story along, or to explicate something about the story and its underlying message, and we shouldn't just put them in just to put them in, okay? So where possible, we should also use the simplest data visualization display types and try to use displays that people are already comfortable with. So don't take for granted that people grow up in grade school and they get exposed to bar charts and line charts, simple data visualization tools and displays. And so as much as we can, we should lean on that. It's easier for people from a cognition and perception standpoint to interpret and comprehend the message or what's being conveyed in that display if they don't have to exert a lot of cognitive energy to understand, wait, what is this I'm looking at? If they understand the framework that this is a bar chart, a taller bar means more of something, that's going to make for a more efficient and hopefully more accurate comprehension when it comes to whatever you're displaying in that data visualization. Now, when designing a data visualization to help tell part of a story, it's helpful to take into consideration the audience's interpretation tasks. So what are you asking them to do, or what do they need to do with respect to the data visualization, as well as the audience's characteristics. So for example, this is a framework that Talia Bauer and I came up with from a publication from 2019. And this is what we refer to as an integrated framework of data visualization, comprehension, and interpretation. And I think it's useful in this context when we're telling a story with data, to think about what are we trying to get people to do in terms of comprehension and interpretation, and then what characteristics of the data visualization, the user, and the environment or the task, and how might that affect people's comprehension and interpretation. So the end state we're really going for here with the data visualization is we're trying to get people to comprehend or interpret something in a particular way. And so we can think about different ways of describing that comprehension and interpretation. We could focus on how quickly people can come to those comprehensions and interpretations. We could also talk about the accuracy of those comprehensions and interpretations. Did they interpret it, in other words, in the way in which we wanted them to interpret it? We can talk about the quality as well as the memorability of the data visualization too. Do they walk away remembering that? Does it resonate? Does it drum up conversations at the water cooler? Also, what was the likability? Did they like that data visualization? And then also, of course, persuasiveness of that data visualization. So these are our outcomes of this framework. Now, one driver, something that can influence or predict these outcomes according to the framework are data visualization characteristics. So characteristics of the data visualization itself, such as what were the underlying data? Were they categorical? Were they quantitative data? What is the display type? Is it a bar chart? Is it a line chart? What are the display format features and so forth? Again, per my earlier statement, the simpler the data visualization, often the more accurately and efficiently people are going to be able to comprehend and interpret what's being displayed. If something gets really complicated or there's a lot of chart junk or chart embellishments, this can adversely affect their speed with which they interpret something and the accuracy of those interpretations. And it could muddle the persuasiveness of what you're trying to convey as a storytelling tool in the data visualization. Now, we should also consider, as I noted a moment ago, the task. So what are we asking the audience to do in terms of their interpretation? Okay, so are we asking them to read an exact value from the data visualization? Are we expecting them to compare values? So if there's two bars in a bar chart, are they looking at these and trying to determine whether there's a difference? Are they trying to identify an association between two variables? Or are they trying to see change over time, for example? And there's other examples we could think about. But we want to also consider how this might affect whatever data visualization we give to people and its characteristics, how that might affect the comprehension and interpretation that people draw from that data visualization. Well, what we're asking them to do in terms of the task could affect the nature of that relationship. Now, in addition, we also want to consider the audience or user characteristics, such as different individual difference variables in terms of their quantitative or data literacy is one thing we could consider. People with higher data literacy are probably going to be able to understand more complex types of data visualization displays and make more quick and accurate comprehension or interpretations based on those, whatever's being displayed. Also, we want to consider the familiarity of the audience or the users in terms of different display types, as well as knowledge of the context that's being presented here. Is a specific area of, like, let's say, benefits or compensation within HR. Well, we want to know, does the audience know anything about that? Because then we'll want to consider how we design the data visualization accordingly to help make that data visualization be more or less amenable to audiences that don't have domain or content knowledge of whatever it is that we're presenting. So again, these are some of the broad categories of things we should consider when it comes to deciding how to design a data visualization tool to hopefully enhance comprehension and interpretation of what we're presenting, as well as thinking critically, how can we do this in the service of the story that we're trying to tell that is going to hopefully take us further along in that process from influence and persuasion to ultimately deployment and implementation of what we're trying to persuade people to enact or to change in the organization or in themselves. Okay, so to wrap up, in this video, we first defined what are influence and persuasion. Next, we talked about the importance of recognizing our own boundaries of expertise. After that, we moved on to talking about the importance of understanding who our audience is going to be that we're going to try to influence and persuade. Then we talked about the importance of crafting a message, and then finished up by talking about how do we actually tell a story, thinking about what a story is, the storytelling structure, as well as how can we use data visualizations to support our story. So here are the references for some of the sources or all the sources that I cited here today. And this wraps up the video on influence and persuasion and how we can use influence and persuasion to inspire change within our organizations.